Floathouses were common among families living in the logging camps in the early days of logging, from around the 1890s to the 1940s. The floathouse would attach to a tugboat by a chain and be pulled to the new camp, making it easy to relocate to a new site. Floathouses were also popular among logging families, as there were few beaches on which they could build settlements within the inlets they were logging. Floathouses are compact living quarters, but this was not due to the lack of pay for loggers, nor was it a byproduct of the 1930s Depression. While some lone bachelors lived on their float cabin and hand-logged to make a living, the museum's floathouse exhibit was modeled after a home for a wife, husband, and a young child in the 1920s. Floathouses were not temporary structures either. In fact, some children would spend a decade living on the floathouse, and some their entire childhood, floating from claim to claim. The newspaper lining the walls wasn't there as merely decor of days gone by, but acted as an insulator for the entire house. People now continue to use newspaper as an insulator in a technique called blown cellulose, where packed shredded newspaper lines the walls. Since the house retained little heat during the winter, the wood-burning stove was of utmost importance to the floathouse. As the house had only one room, the stove could heat the entire home. It also acted as a place to dry wet clothes. Despite living on the water, wood stoves still presented a fire hazard. As the house was quite small, there was no privacy between family members. So, when nature called, a floathouse dweller literally went into nature. Also closer to nature was the refrigeration system. This cold box next to the door was the refrigerator, as temperatures on the sea could drop quite low. However, the box was of little use during the daytime in the summer. Children who grew up on floathouses learned to be quite agile as they walked to shore by crossing over the log booms. Life jackets were a non-negotiable part of children's wardrobes. They would go on in the morning and come off at bedtime. A visiting sportsman described the log booms children would walk across. The river for about a mile from its mouth is practically blocked with great rafts of enormous logs. The logs are discharged into the river with a roar and a crash, enough to frighten every fish out of the water. Rowboats and canoes were the main way families traveled around the coast. Some children were rowing before they could walk. While education may not have looked identical to the systems we have now, children were still expected to attend school. These floating communities were almost floating villages, some even having post offices and schools of their own. The children who lived in floathouse communities not large enough to have schools would take correspondence classes or be shipped away to live with a family in a community that needed more children in order to form a school. Our warmly lit replica of a floathouse may seem cozy and romantic, but to many women they were isolated and difficult places to live, as many had to make the transition from city home to a cabin or tent. Bound to the floathouse and with nowhere to go, many women would be completely alone for 3 or 4 days. To remedy the loneliness, women reached out to each other through the formation of women's clubs, sports teams, and holding social events such as dances or sewing classes through the church. Residents would make long, risky boat trips through bad weather to attend such events. The weekly arrival of the Union steamship was also a highlight of the week. The ship brought passengers, mail, goods, and seeing the boat dock was something to do. The Columbia Coast Mission Ship also serviced these remote communities, acting as a floating hospital, movie theater, and library. Unlike the families who were pioneering in the bush, families living in logging camps had more predictable access to healthcare. Visiting nurses would come to camps to give vaccinations, and emergency stations were set up to treat loggers who had been injured on the job. Women still had their own herbal remedies for aches, pains, and wounds, and everyone knew first aid. While life on the Floathouse was difficult, many women say, looking back, they wouldn't have wished it any other way. The experience brought out strengths they didn't know they had, and sharing those strengths with those around you built courage.